Mike should be back from the printer with his shirt soon, so let's put the finishing touches on the site. We still need to add the code that sends us an email whenever a visitor fills out our contact form. We skipped over that earlier since it was a bit complicated, but I think we're ready for it now. We need to do some validation on the values from the form first, and then we'll use a third-party library to handle the sending. Open up the contact.php file in your text editor. Remember that this one file handles all 3 steps of the contact form process: displaying the form, handling the submission, and then displaying the thank you message. This code here at the top checks if the request method is POST, which tells us when the form has been submitted. Right now, a visitor to our site could leave all 3 fields blank and submit the form. We don't want emails without an address to reply to or without a message, so let's make sure that the name, email address, and message fields have values. First, we'll write a conditional that checks that the name variable has a value. We'll put this validation here after we load the values from the post array into working variables, but before we generate the email body and send the email. If the name variable doesn't have a value, let's echo out an error message. When we encounter a blank value, let's exit so that none of the other code in this file processes. This will catch the case where the name is left blank entirely, but what if someone types just a space or a tab? That's kind of like leaving it blank, so we probably don't want to allow that either. There's a PHP function we can use to help us here called trim. This function trims white space off the beginning and the end of a piece of text. That white space includes spaces, tabs, and hard returns. It leaves the spaces between the words, it just removes them from the beginning and the end. If you don't want a blank value in a variable, it's always a good idea to trim that variable to make sure that it really does have a value. We could add the trim function here inside the conditional, like this. That would make our conditional work like we want, but it would leave the name variable unchanged. This function returns a trimmed value, but it doesn't actually change the original variable. We'd usually be better off trimming the name variable itself earlier in our code, so that throughout the rest of the code it will have a trimmed value. We should trim the email address and the message variables also. We next want to make sure that the email address has a value. We could add another conditional just like this one, but let's try something else. Let's modify this conditional to check that both variables have a value. If either one of them is blank, we want to display an error message. If the name is blank, or if the email address is blank. We can add an OR to our conditional to check that. Let's also check the message variable for a value in this conditional. We want to display an error message when any of these 3 values is blank, when name is blank, or email is blank, or message is blank. Let's take a look at the contact form in the browser. Let's submit it with blank values. We display this error now and stop the form from processing before we try to send an email. We have some basic form validation in place now to check that the values aren't left blank, but unfortunately, that won't be all the validation that we need to do. I think it's time for us to have the talk. There are a lot of great things about the internet, but I'm afraid it's not all roses and sunshine out there. There are dangerous things, scary things. Once you put a form out on the internet that accepts information from anyone, you expose yourself to some of that danger. I hate to speak so seriously and negatively, but form security is very important. There are evil spammer robots out there right now, scouring the internet looking for forms they can hijack for their evil ends. There are 2 main spammer attacks we need to address. The first is mostly harmless but terribly annoying. These robots fill out forms hoping that their submissions will be displayed on a web page somewhere, like comment forms on blogs. These robots hope the links they post will get counted as backlinks by search engines. If one of these robots finds your form, you could end up with way more email from your contact form than you could ever want. The second attack is much more harmful. Contact forms typically send an email to the website owner. Some clever robots figured out how to fill out the message field in such a way that they can actually inject additional recipients into the email. If you're not careful, they could use your form to send out thousands and thousands of spam emails to other people. Your web host might shut down your contact form, or maybe even your whole website. Yes, that would be very bad. Let's improve our form validation to address these two attacks. You can read more about the second attack, the serious email injection hack, over at the New York PHP site. They provide a code snippet we can use to stop this attack, which I'll paste in here. This code loops through the post array using a for each loop, loading each element one at a time into a working variable called value. It then uses a function and a conditional to check if each post variable contains a malicious value. If it finds one, it stops the PHP file from executing. Let's also display an error message here. There are a number of different ways to address the first hack, the less serious but pretty annoying comment spam attack. I recommend a technique known as a spam honeypot field. It's not perfect, but it's always been pretty effective for me. Most of these evil robots fill out every field in a form just in case they are required, and this technique takes advantage of that. We need to scroll down and add a new field to our form, one we don't want our visitors to fill out. Give it a name and a label that makes it look like a real field, something like address. But then we hide it with CSS. Let's set display none on the table row. When a visitor to our site views it in a visual browser, they won't be able to see that field and they'll leave it blank. But these evil robots don't use a browser. They simply scrape the HTML and look for input fields. They usually don't realize that this field is invisible, and they'll fill it in with a value. Back at the top of the form, after our other two checks, we can check if this field has a value, that is, if it's not blank. If it's not blank, then we assume that an evil robot is filling out the form and stop executing the file. It's unlikely, but it is possible that the CSS won't load and a legitimate visitor to your site might see that field. Just in case, it's a good idea to display a note with the field. Most legitimate users won't see this, but it's a good idea to have this here just in case. That was quite a bit of work, but I feel good about the amount of validation on our form. Let's now move on and get that third-party library in place.